Welcome everyone. Today we are going to do a literary analysis. And some of you may be wondering what constitutes a literary analysis. A literary analysis is not so different than what you have done probably in previous classes for a research paper. You have a research question and you then use that question to develop a kind of interpretation of whatever problem it is you're trying to solve. In order to prove that interpretation, then you have to go back and use your research and cite examples and all those kinds of things. So it's the same thing. It's just instead of a huge body of research that you got from databases, we really focus on a particular text, perhaps a poem or a short story that we want to analyze. Now, to help us do this, we have what are called critical approaches. Here's a list of them now. So these critical approaches come from a variety of different disciplines. They really push us from literary analysis as a leisure activity into a more academic, rigorous pursuit. And basically all they are is a kind of grouping of questions. They help us see things in a text and then develop that interpretation with a bit more focus and a bit more rigor. I am using today an exercise that was developed by my colleague Diane Critchfield at Germanna Community College. She's awesome. You should take her classes. We're going to apply this approach to a fairly basic text. We're going to do a college-level literary analysis of the nursery rhyme Jack and Jill. Because we're doing some craft work today with literary analysis, I've bought my handy toolbox. And in this toolbox, as I open it up, you will see that I have all the tools I need for a proper literary analysis. All right? So, a whole set of lenses. Now, each one of these lenses is going to correspond to one of those critical approaches. No matter what lens I put on, the text itself doesn't really change. It's not as if Edgar Allan Poe wrote a poem in the Marxist approach. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe had no idea what Marxism was. It really wasn't expressed within his lifetime. So the critical approach is what you apply to the text in order to tease out a deeper meaning within the text. So I'm going to introduce the entire poem. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Up Jack got, and home did trot as fast as he could caper. Went to bed to mend his head with vinegar and brown paper. Jill came in and she did grin to see his paper plaster. Mother, vexed, did whip her next for causing Jack's disaster. So now we have our full poem, and the first critical approach we're going to apply is the feminist approach. With my feminist lenses on, I am going to see some glaring elements of this nursery rhyme. My eyes will go straight to the last stanza and consider, why is it that Jill is blamed for Jack's fall? And in fact, it is the mother, the matriarch, who places the full blame of the accident on Jill. Furthermore, what we know about Jack and Jill is that in its early rendition, they weren't two children. In fact, they were teenagers, essentially, in the way that they were presented visually. And that means there has always been a kind of suggestive element, sexually suggestive element, of Jack and Jill. That Jack and Jill are going up the hill to fetch a pail of water in the sense that they are being sexually promiscuous. Jack has a fall, and of course Jill is blamed for the fall.
Jack and Jill went up the hill both with $1.25. Jill came down with $2.50.
Now, this fits right in line with a kind of feminist reading that would raise alarm and say, well, why is it that the mother here is punishing Jill for Jack's perhaps poor decision or his metaphorical fall? So what is a thesis statement that I could derive from this feminist lens? The nursery rhyme Jack and Jill perpetuates the sexist trope of the female being responsible and held accountable for the male's actions. Furthermore, it demonstrates how matriarchs are one of the primary tools to instill the patriarchal structure. Okay, so now I'm going to take my feminist lenses off, and I am going to put on the lenses for the psychological approach. A psychological approach, if I were to use, let's say, Freud, would look at the text of Jack and Jill and start to look for sort of models of the mind as well as particular symbols that we might use. I'm going to use an obvious one, foundational to Freudian psychology, where you have the three layers of the mind. The id, which is desire, and you have the superego, which is morality. And then the ego balances between the two. The ego helps us see when it is right and wrong to do something, but we still have that part of our brain that is desirous. With these lenses on, I might look at Jack and Jill and focus on some elements like what is the journey for? So there is a compulsion to go get the water. And remember, this has some sexual undertones to it, and Freud would have a field day with that. The id is compelling them, pushing them, or at least pushing Jack towards the water. And of course, what comes down is his fall. He pursues his desires too far, whether it's in the form of water or whether it's in the form of Jill, and he falls because of it. He runs to his mother. The mother becomes a kind of superego, right? And this is typical in nursery rhymes where the matriarch would come in with some kind of moral lesson. And the moral lesson is, Jill, why did you do that? This ultimately means that Jack never really develops a ego. He goes from id, the water, to the superego, his mother. Interesting to note, in many of the renditions, after Jack falls down and breaks his crown and then he has the vinegar and paper applied, the next stanza, the last stanza, is Jack and Jill going back up the hill again. Like he didn't learn any lesson.
Are you still seeing Jill?
Uh-huh. Jack and Jill, I hope she's on the pill.
What thesis statement could we draw from this using the psychological approach? In the nursery rhyme Jack and Jill, the character Jack is doomed to perpetuate his disastrous mistakes because his mind fails to recognize the moral lesson needed to keep his dangerous desires in check. For our last one, we're going to take a look at the Marxist approach. Marxist references Karl Marx. Karl Marx was the co-author of the Communist Manifesto. So a disclaimer here. Using the Marxist approach does not mean that you are a communist. As you look at the text, you are going to be searching for elements of economic goods, things of value, and power structures that are employed through that value. So Marxists are all kind of economists at heart on some level, but we see that society is very much shaped by economies and things of value and power structures, and so they enter into a text thinking about these kinds of things. This might feel like a little bit of a stretch, to be honest, but let's try it out anyways. So with our Marxist lenses on, one of the elements that we would look at in Jack and Jill is the thing that they are trying to get, the water. And of course, the water seems to be in an inherently dangerous place. It's on top of a hill. And who put it on top of a hill? So the Marxist would look at this and say, well, rich people don't go to get their own water back in the day, right? It was the poor people that had to go get it. And so what you have is an essential resource that is removed, somewhat distant, in a seemingly dangerous place, and the young people, child labor, the young people would have to go get this and compromise their well-being and safety. And on top of that, if we go back to this idea that at the end of many versions of Jack and Jill, they're sent back up the hill to get the pail of water, then we see again that even though they are, or at least Jack is injured, that they're sent back out to get the resource. So what thesis statement could we draw using a Marxist lens? Jack and Jill represents how the placement of essential resources is often done without consideration of the people that need it most. Thus, the weak and the poor must bear the burdens created by the rich man's blindness. Okay, so there are many different critical approaches. It's not just three. I just wanted to give you kind of a sense of how these worked. Critical approaches are designed to help you. They are a kind of toolbox that help develop an interpretation and focus that interpretation into a kind of deeper meaning. It is worth noting, I think, that some texts lend themselves better to certain critical approaches than others. As you can tell, the feminist approach would have a field day with Jack and Jill, but at the end, the Marxist approach was struggling a bit because there isn't that much there in terms of commodities. But that said, you can use whatever approach best suits you, your reading, as well as the text. So I hope you have a better understanding now of critical approaches, and it will deepen your ability to appreciate and interpret literature.